Before modern rations, soldiers had to rely on ingenuity to fuel their grueling marches and battles. Filling their stomachs wasn't easy, and these meals weren't winning prizes, but they kept those brave men moving. Today, I will guide you through the fascinating history of what soldiers ate before rations were the norm. Imagine biting into something so hard that it could double as a building material. That was hardtack, a dense, dry biscuit made from flour, water, and sometimes salt. It wasn't exactly a culinary delight, but it was a lifesaver for soldiers and sailors on long campaigns. Its secret was longevity. Properly stored, hardtack could last for years and, in some cases, even decades. But eating it wasn't for the faint of heart or teeth. Soldiers often joked it was hard enough to stop a bullet. To make it edible, many soaked it in water, coffee, or stew to soften it. Without that, breaking it might feel like a test of willpower. Salted and cured to withstand long journeys, dried fish added essential nutrients, though the smell wasn't exactly subtle. Imagine a ship full of men and barrels of dried fish during a humid summer. Let's just say it's a good thing Fabrezy wasn't invented yet. These simple foods fueled explorers, sailors, and armies through grueling months without fresh supplies. Though unassuming, they were engineering marvels of preservation and utility, proof that survival often came at the cost of flavor. Life on the march wasn't glamorous, and neither was the food, but it was dependable. Pottage was the workhorse of pre-modern diets, a thick, hearty stew made from whatever grains, legumes, and vegetables were on hand. Think of it as the ultimate clean-out-the-pantry recipe, centuries before that was trendy. It was survival in a pot. Soldiers would boil ingredients together, letting them simmer for hours over a fire. Barley, peas, lentils, onions, whatever was in season or could last on the road made it in. And if you were lucky enough to have access to bread, it became the perfect accompaniment to soak up every last drop. Pottage was endlessly customizable. In lean times, it might be just barley and water. During rare moments of abundance, soldiers might toss in some herbs, bones, or even a bit of meat, transforming it into a feast. Medieval armies didn't have Michelin stars, but they did know how to stretch a meal. Of course, it wasn't always exciting. It was the same flavor, day after day. Still, when you're cold, hungry, and far from home, a bowl of pottage could taste better than gold. After all, the real luxury was staying alive and staying warm. Preserving food was a matter of survival, and for soldiers on the move, smoked meat was more than a meal, it was a lifeline. Long before refrigeration, smoke was nature's preservative, infusing meat with flavor while keeping bacteria at bay. Unlike salted meat, which could be tough and overwhelmingly briny, smoked venison, beef, or even pork offered a more palatable and aromatic option. The process wasn't quick. Smoking meat required hours, sometimes days, over low, consistent heat, with wood types carefully chosen for their flavor. Hickory, oak, and applewood were integral to the preservation process. Once smoked, the meat could last for weeks or even months, making it ideal for soldiers who had to carry their food supply on their backs. This preservation method wasn't without its quirks. Smokehouses where the magic happened became a common sight near military camps. They were so important that losing one to fire or sabotage could cripple an army's food reserves. Of course, the soldiers weren't exactly gourmands. A joke went that smoked meat was great for keeping your teeth in shape, if you could chew through it. But on a cold night, after a long march, a strip of smoked beef paired with bread or pottage was as close to comfort food as a soldier could get. For soldiers on the march, portability was everything, and few foods were as reliable as bread and cheese. Roman legionnaires famously carried flat loaves of bread and wedges of hard cheese, often made from sheep or goat's milk. The combination was a nutritional powerhouse, carbs for energy and protein for strength, all in a package that could survive the harsh conditions of a campaign. But let's not romanticize it. The bread was often dense and tough, more akin to a brick than a baguette. Soldiers sometimes had to soak it in water or wine just to make it chewable. The cheese wasn't the creamy delight you'd find at a deli. Aged for durability, it leaned more toward rock hard than velvety soft. Still, when paired together, They made a meal that was surprisingly satisfying and, most importantly, long-lasting. In medieval times, knights and foot soldiers kept the tradition alive, carrying wheels of cheese and hearty loaves during long marches. Back then, breaking bread wasn't just a saying, it was a literal act of survival. Sure, it wasn't gourmet, but when the choice is between stale bread and hunger, even a Roman would tell you, the bread wins every time. When supplies ran low and options grew scarce, armies turned to one of the simplest meals imaginable, gruel. A combination of ground grain, usually oats, barley, or wheat, and water, gruel was the ultimate no-frills survival food. It wasn't much to look at, and it wasn't much to taste either, but it got the job done. Gruel's strength was its efficiency. It required minimal ingredients, little preparation, and just a single pot over a fire to cook. This made it ideal for armies on the move or besieged soldiers stuck in fortifications. Plus, it could be stretched to feed large groups, which made it invaluable during times of scarcity. That said, calling it bland would be an understatement. Soldiers often described it as thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl. If you were lucky, you might get a sprinkle of salt or a scrap of fat tossed in for flavor. If you were really lucky, you didn't think too hard about what might have fallen into the pot along the way. Still, gruel earned its place in military history. It was cheap, filling, and easy to digest, exactly what armies needed to keep marching. In the chaos of ancient and medieval warfare, time was a luxury, and so was leavened bread. When soldiers needed sustenance on the go, they turned to flatbread, a simple yet effective solution. Made from flour and water, sometimes with a pinch of salt, it required no rising time and could be baked on a flat stone or a metal plate over an open fire. Flatbread was a culinary bridge between cultures. From the Roman legions to medieval Arab armies, its versatility made it a universal staple. Soldiers could eat it plain, use it to scoop up stew, or even wrap it around dried meat for an early version of the sandwich. And unlike leavened bread, flatbread was far more forgiving. It could survive days of travel without becoming a crumbly mess. It wasn't all perfection, though. Cooking over a fire meant the bread could be scorched in seconds if you weren't careful. More than a few soldiers probably had to settle for extra crispy flatbread when they got distracted by a battle horn. Still, this simple, adaptable bread earned its reputation as a battlefield favorite. For centuries, armies on the move relied on foods that were as tough as the soldiers themselves. Dried beans and lentils were real tiny powerhouses of nutrition that were easy to carry, nearly impossible to spoil, and packed with protein and calories. With a little water and patience, these humble legumes could transform into a hearty meal capable of sustaining entire armies. They were very economical. A single sack of lentils could feed dozens, making them a staple in ancient armies like the Romans and the Greeks. Lentils were so integral to the Roman diet that some historians called them the soldier's caviar, though that might have been more wishful thinking than reality. Cooking them, however, wasn't always straightforward. Soldiers often had to soak them overnight, a luxury they didn't always have during marches or battles. This meant the occasional crunchy surprise when time ran out. Despite their simplicity, beans and lentils had one undeniable perk. They could adapt to almost any flavor. Whether cooked in a broth with onions and herbs or simply boiled with a pinch of salt, they delivered the nourishment soldiers needed to keep fighting. And while no one was writing poetry about legumes, one thing was certain: these little guys pulled their weight. During long campaigns, soldiers often had to rely on more than just their rations to stay fed. When the opportunity arose, hunting for fresh meat became not just a necessity, but a small victory in the midst of the hardships. Rabbits, deer, and wild boar were common targets. These animals were perfect for feeding a small group and could be cooked over a fire with minimal preparation. Roasting game was a simple process. After a successful hunt, soldiers would often skin and gut the animal, then roast it directly over an open flame or on a spit. The smell of cooking meat could be both a comfort and a temptation, scenting the air as a reminder that fresh food was not always a guarantee. While hunting provided nourishment, it wasn't without its challenges. A missed shot or a wounded animal could turn an evening meal into a frustrating effort. Hunting also brought a sense of normalcy during chaotic times. It was one of the few moments when soldiers could experience a taste of home, enjoying freshly prepared food, even if only for a brief moment. When meat was available, it was considered a prized delicacy, especially if the alternative was the more unappetizing, less exciting preserved food. Whether roasted over an open flame or eaten raw, fresh game was a rare but cherished reward in the soldier's diet. Simple, humble, and surprisingly effective, onion soup became a go-to meal for soldiers who needed something quick, warm, and filling. With minimal ingredients, just onions and water, it was an easy dish to prepare when supplies were low and it could stretch to feed large groups. In fact, onion soup was often seen as the best option when no other fresh ingredients were readily available. Onions themselves are a wonder of survival. Packed with vitamins and nutrients, they can help sustain soldiers during long marches or in the midst of battle fatigue. And while onion soup might not have been gourmet, it had one undeniable advantage. It was easy to make. Boil up some onions, add water, and season with whatever was at hand: salt, pepper, maybe a bit of dried herbs, and you had yourself a meal. The simplicity of onion soup may have made it unremarkable to some, but to soldiers on the move, it was nothing short of a lifesaver. After all, when you are miles away from the nearest bakery, sometimes the most comforting thing is the smell of onions simmering in a pot. A few slices of stale bread dunked in the soup could make a soldier feel like royalty. Fermented foods were a soldier's unsung hero in the field because of their long shelf life, health benefits, and easy storage. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and fermented grains were common staples, valued for their ability to withstand harsh conditions without spoiling. And when you're out in the middle of nowhere, that's a pretty big deal. The process of fermentation, which involves converting sugars into alcohol or acids, offered a natural boost to the immune system. Fermented foods like sauerkraut are rich in probiotics, which help with digestion and overall gut health. Soldiers, especially during long campaigns, appreciated the natural preservation methods. Without refrigeration, these foods could survive months in storage, often more reliable than any other food they had on hand. While fermented foods may not have been the most exciting part of a soldier's diet, they served a crucial purpose. They were easy to transport, didn't require constant attention, and provided essential nutrients. After a long day in the field, a bite of tangy sauerkraut might have been a welcome change from the usual dried meats or hardtack. Fermented foods were a lifeline in keeping soldiers healthy, and often they gave a taste of home when nothing else could. For sailors at sea, ship's biscuit was the original survival food. Tough, durable, and ready for whatever the ocean could throw at it. Made from flour, water, and sometimes salt, this dense, rock-like bread was a necessity during long voyages. The biscuits were designed to last for months without spoiling, but in the humid, salty conditions aboard ships, they often came with an unwelcome bonus: weevils. Yes, those little critters that make every meal feel like a crunch on a whole new level. Despite its toughness and the occasional extra protein from those weevils, ship's biscuit was a staple for maritime forces. While sailors would dunk them in water or soup to soften them, it didn't make them any more appetizing. In fact, if you've ever wondered why sailors were often depicted with a scowl, maybe it wasn't just the rough seas. Maybe it was the food. The biscuit's longevity was its biggest asset. In a world where fresh food was a luxury, ship's biscuit could endure for months in storage. But let's face it, if your lunch comes with a side of bugs, you might start dreaming of anything but biscuits. Still, it was a part of naval life. Tough, resilient, and certainly something you'd hope to eat only out of necessity. Imagine a meal that's thick, hearty, and packed with protein. Yet, it might not be winning any Michelin stars. That's where this dish comes in. Made from split peas boiled in water, it's simple, filling, and full of energy. Pease porridge, as it was known, was a go-to for soldiers who needed something to fuel them through the day without any frills. The beauty of this dish was that it's inexpensive, easy to prepare, and could be made in large batches. It didn't matter if you were in medieval Europe or marching across the battlefield in the 17th century, peas were a reliable source of nutrition. Soldiers appreciated the protein boost, and for many, it was the backbone of their diet. While it didn't have the most exciting flavor, pease porridge was practical. Soldiers often ate it with a bit of bread, or on a good day, meat or dried herbs to add some variety. The texture was thick, almost like a stew, but still simple enough to cook over a campfire or on a stove. If you were stuck with this dish for days on end, you'd either become an expert in creative seasoning or learn to love the taste of simplicity. If it's good enough to survive a campaign, it's good enough for dinner. In the Americas, soldiers didn't always have the luxury of fancy meals or fresh produce. Instead, they often relied on cornmeal, a staple that could be boiled up into a simple, hearty mush. Known as cornmeal mush, this dish wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, but it did the job, filling soldiers' stomachs and providing much-needed energy. The process was straightforward. Cornmeal was boiled in water until it thickened into a creamy, porridge-like consistency. Though plain, it was easily adapted. Some soldiers would add a pinch of salt, while others might include a bit of sugar or molasses if available. And on occasion, if they were lucky enough, a splash of milk or butter would make it a bit more palatable. Cornmeal mush was cheap, durable, and easy to prepare in large quantities, making it a popular choice during long campaigns. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, it was commonly served to American soldiers. If there was one thing they could count on, it was that their mush would be there to keep them going. While it might not have been the most exciting meal in the world, cornmeal mush was dependable. When you're fighting for freedom, or just trying to make it through another day in camp, sometimes simple sustenance is all you need. During long military campaigns, soldiers needed food that could withstand the rigors of travel, storage, and time. Salt pork and beans, a combination that became a military staple, particularly during the colonial and Napoleonic Wars. Salt pork was the go-to protein for soldiers because it could be stored for months without refrigeration. The pork was heavily salted to preserve it, a method that also gave it a distinctive, sometimes overpowering flavor. Soldiers learned to love, or at least tolerate, the salty taste, especially when paired with the hearty goodness of beans. Beans, often the dried variety, were another long-lasting and easy-to-prepare food source. When combined with salt pork, they formed a simple, calorie-dense meal that could be boiled up over a campfire. Whether cooked with a little extra fat or simply simmered in water, this dish provided the soldiers with both protein and the energy to endure grueling days on the march. Of course, the meal was hardly a gourmet affair. In fact, some soldiers were less than thrilled by the monotony of it. As any soldier might tell you, when it comes to survival food, variety takes a backseat to reliability. Salt pork and beans delivered just that, reliable sustenance no matter the season or the conditions. When fresh vegetables were available, soldiers and civilians alike turned to cabbage soup, a humble yet filling dish that required little more than a few ingredients and a fire. In fact, cabbage itself was a go-to vegetable in many military camps due to its ability to store well, even in the harshest conditions. Cabbage was cheap, abundant, and packed with nutrients, making it an ideal choice for a simple soup. The dish typically consisted of cabbage, water, and a pinch of salt, basic ingredients that could stretch even the smallest rations. On occasion, a little meat or fat might be added to enhance the flavor, though it was hardly a guarantee. The simplicity of the soup made it a favorite for armies, where nutrition was a priority over luxury. While cabbage soup might not have been the most exciting meal, it was reliable. A warm bowl could offer soldiers some comfort after long marches or cold nights. It also offered essential vitamins, particularly vitamin C, which helped prevent scurvy, a common concern among sailors and soldiers. When the days were long and the supplies were short, this simple dish could keep the hunger at bay, and, if nothing else, remind soldiers that the next meal might be a little more exciting. Among the meals that fueled armies across Northern Europe, few were as humble and essential as porridge. Whether made from oats, barley, or a mix of both, this hearty dish was a staple in the Scottish Highlands and across many Northern European forces. Easy to prepare, filling, and rich in nutrients, porridge was a soldier's reliable companion, especially in colder climates where extra calories were crucial for maintaining energy. Soldiers were often given a basic porridge made from oats and barley, both of which were cheap and durable. The simplicity of the dish didn't stop there. Flavoring was minimal, often just a sprinkle of salt. However, on rare occasions, dried fruits like raisins or berries might be thrown in for a touch of sweetness, a welcome surprise in an otherwise bland meal. But the real beauty of porridge was its versatility. Whether served thick and dense or thinner, it could be adapted to whatever was available. The grains were easy to store and transport, and the dish could be cooked over a fire without requiring much effort. When times were tough, oats and barley provided soldiers with the carbohydrates and fiber they needed to power through long, exhausting days on the march. On the open seas, sailors had to get creative with how they stored and preserved their food. Fresh meat was a luxury, but smoked fish? That was a game changer. Whether caught in coastal waters or dried after a long journey, smoked fish became an essential part of the naval diet. Durable, portable, and with a shelf life far beyond what fresh meat could offer. The process was simple. Catch the fish, smoke it over a fire, and let the preservation magic happen. Fish like herring, mackerel, and cod were common choices. The smoking process not only preserved the fish, but also gave it a distinctive, salty flavor that would fuel sailors during long voyages or when supplies were running low. On board ships, where space and storage were often cramped, smoked fish was a savior. It didn't require refrigeration because it had already been preserved by the smoke and could be eaten straight from the barrel or used in stews or soups. In some cases, it was even a way to stretch out limited rations, adding protein and sustenance when other food sources ran dry. While you might not find smoked fish on your dinner plate tonight, for centuries, it was the sailor's trusty food companion, ensuring no one went hungry even when they were hundreds of miles from shore. A soldier in the trenches, weary from the day's march, taking a moment to relax with a mug of beer in hand and a hunk of cheese by their side. It might seem like a simple luxury, but for soldiers throughout history, beer and cheese were essential parts of their rations. Soldiers in ancient Rome and during the Napoleonic Wars were often issued daily beer rations. This wasn't just for comfort. Beer, with its high water content, was a safer alternative to potentially contaminated water. It was a source of hydration, calories, and a little morale boost. The beer often wasn't the craft brews we enjoy today, but a more basic, hearty brew that could be easily consumed in the field. Cheese, on the other hand, was a perfect companion. Its durability made it ideal for soldiers on the move. Hard cheeses like Parmesan or Gouda, which could withstand long journeys, were often paired with bread. The protein-rich cheese kept soldiers full, providing energy for long campaigns. While the pairing may seem basic, it was a strategic choice. Beer and cheese provided the nourishment soldiers needed. Stewed turnips were the kind of dish you'd find bubbling over campfires or hearths in military camps, especially during tough campaigns. Turnips, often overlooked today in favor of more glamorous vegetables, were a soldier's steadfast companion throughout history. They were easy to grow, quick to harvest, and kept well, making them an essential part of the soldier's diet. Root vegetables like turnips could be cooked in a variety of ways, but stewing them with any available meat or fat brought out their earthy flavor and provided much-needed calories. In times when fresh meat was scarce, the fat rendered from salt pork or whatever meat was available helped create a filling, nutrient-rich meal. Stewed turnips also had a long shelf life, making them ideal for soldiers on the move. It wasn't gourmet, but it was sustenance, and in the harsh conditions of war, that was often enough. While we might joke today about turnip stew, it was a crucial dish for many armies, offering a much-needed boost of energy to keep soldiers marching forward. A turnip could serve as both food and makeshift weapon. After all, it's hard to argue with a turnip's versatility. Lentil stew was a popular choice for armies in need of a high-protein, long-lasting food source. Dried lentils, easy to store and transport, packed a nutritional punch. For soldiers on the move, these tiny legumes could provide both sustenance and energy during grueling campaigns. Packed with fiber, protein, and iron, lentils were often simmered with whatever spices or vegetables were at hand. Simple but efficient. What makes lentil stew so interesting is its versatility. With the right ingredients, it could be tailored to fit the region's available resources. In places where fresh vegetables were scarce, the lentils acted as the star, absorbing flavors from salt pork or dried meats. While it may not have been the most exciting meal, it was certainly reliable. Imagine having a dish that could fuel you through a long march and leave you feeling full. Pretty much the perfect comfort food for someone who's been up before dawn and marched all day. In the world of wartime meals, lentil stew might not have won any culinary awards, but it definitely kept the troops marching forward. Imagine being a soldier in the Revolutionary War, miles from home, marching through thick woods, only to sit down to a simple but hearty meal of Johnnycakes. Made from cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, these flatbreads were a quick, no-frills source of sustenance that could be easily cooked over a fire. No need for fancy kitchens here, just a hot pan and a bit of elbow grease. The origin of Johnnycakes is debated, with some believing they were brought over by early colonists from England, while others argue they were born out of necessity in the American colonies. Either way, they became a staple for soldiers, offering a quick energy boost without requiring much effort. The name itself is thought to come from the term journey cakes, referring to their portability and ability to last on long trips. Johnnycakes were often eaten alongside salt pork or a hasty stew, perfect for a soldier on the go. And though they were far from gourmet, they provided a comforting sense of routine, a little taste of home in the midst of war. As any soldier would tell you, when you're fighting for freedom, sometimes simplicity is the best ingredient. A damp, cold day on the battlefield, the wind howling as British soldiers huddle around a fire. What's for dinner? Mutton stew. A hearty, flavorful dish made with tender sheep meat and root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips. It may not be haute cuisine, but for an army on the move, it was just what they needed. Filling, nutritious, and comforting. Mutton, the meat of an older sheep, was often the go-to choice for British forces. It was cheap, readily available, and unlike more delicate meats, it could withstand long periods of transport without spoiling. In fact, many soldiers would carry dried or salted mutton with them, knowing that it would rehydrate nicely in a stew. As British armies marched across Europe, mutton stew became a staple of their diet, providing much-needed energy for the long days of fighting and marching. And while the stew wasn't exactly a five-star meal, it was practical. After all, when you're outnumbered or far from home, it's all about making the most of what you've got. Whether served with a crusty piece of bread or just in a humble bowl, mutton stew reminds us that sometimes the most enduring meals are the simplest. On the march, soldiers needed food that was easy to carry and could withstand days, if not weeks, of travel. Hard cheese and apples might sound simple, but it was a practical and reliable choice for soldiers on the move. Hard cheeses, like cheddar or Gouda, were ideal for military rations. They had a long shelf life, didn't spoil easily, and were rich in fat and protein, perfect for keeping soldiers fueled during long marches. As for the apples, they weren't just a quick snack. Apples have been a soldier's best friend for centuries, offering a refreshing burst of vitamin C to fend off scurvy and other maladies. Plus, they're compact, lightweight, and pretty much immune to the rigors of travel. This combination was favored by armies across Europe and the Americas. While it may not have been gourmet, it was practical, offering a little balance of protein, carbs, and hydration when fresh food was scarce. And who's to say that in the heat of battle, you wouldn't appreciate the simple satisfaction of biting into a crunchy apple paired with a slice of sharp cheese? Sometimes when the marching's done and you're finally sitting down to rest, it's hard cheese and apples that hit the spot. When it comes to making the most out of tougher cuts of meat, few dishes are as effective as vinegar-braised meats, or as the Germans call it, Sauerbraten. This dish was a game-changer for soldiers who had to stretch their rations, making the toughest cuts of beef or pork tender and flavorful. The secret to it was vinegar. The acidic marinade broke down the meat's fibers, tenderizing it while adding a rich, tangy flavor. It was also a practical way of preserving meat. In a time when refrigeration was non-existent, Preserving food with vinegar kept it edible longer, a necessity for armies on the move. The marinade could be prepared with a variety of spices, often including cloves, onions, and peppercorns, to give it that unmistakable depth of flavor. For the soldiers of Europe, this dish became a comforting meal, especially when fresh meat was scarce. It was hearty, rich in protein, and incredibly filling, all while preserving what might otherwise have gone bad. When you're out in the field, a pot of well-braised meat can be a taste of home, no matter where you are. There's something almost poetic about braising tough meat until it's melt in your mouth tender. Not a bad way to turn a hard day's march into something worth savoring. By the 19th century, hot beverages had become a comforting staple for soldiers on long marches or during harsh campaigns. Coffee and tea provided much-needed warmth and a slight caffeine boost to help soldiers power through the day. Whether it was the bitter taste of coffee or the soothing essence of tea, these drinks were often paired with something simple but satisfying: dry biscuits. Biscuits, hard and unyielding, were the soldiers' dependable companion. They weren't known for their fluffiness, but for their durability. These dry biscuits could withstand months of storage without going stale, making them the perfect accompaniment for the drink that kept soldiers awake through the night watch or ready for battle come morning. Hoover stew was one of those dishes that anyone could afford to make, so it is no wonder that the stew was a common item in the Great Depression. Hoover stew had two signature traits. It could feed the whole family, and you could have the dish without exceeding the monthly budget. As for the recipe, the dish involved using scraps and leftovers to increase savings and recycling in a time when households could not afford a lot. You did not need many spices, and you could easily use leftover meats. In an America where banks were going bankrupt and the job market was hopeless, the stew was a welcome addition. Obviously, it would be a popular choice among many households, as our older viewers might still remember. Fortunately, as economic stability came back, Hoover stew went away from tables in favor of more flavorful and varied stews. When you think of popcorn, the Dust Bowl era is probably the last thing that comes to mind. Popcorn is the comfort food of the movie theaters, but believe it or not, they were still all the rage back in the 30s when options were limited. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. When milk was available, it was poured over freshly popped popcorn to turn the snack into a whole meal. Milk was scarce, so it wasn't always available, but when it was, this meal was everyone's go-to. Popcorn was a cheap and easily accessible grain, and milk, if you were lucky enough to have some, added a bit of protein and calcium. It might not be your first choice for a fancy dinner, but it was a clever way to make do with what was available. Beef barley soup is but a humble dish that comes right from tales of peasant wives making hearty breakfasts for their families. Sorry for sounding like a Lord of the Rings extra for a second. Really though, beef barley soup is as vintage as a recipe can get. Barley itself is one of the most ancient grains we have, not just in the States, but all across the world. Again, the idea of pairing it with beef is something we took from our European buddies that immigrated to Uncle Sam's greener pastures. When they weren't looking so green, and trust me, the 1930s and 40s were a long time, it was in everyone's mutual interest to play it smart. By that I mean there was a lot of inspiration to take from all the different communities around in the States. What is America if not a melting pot of different cultures? Beef barley soup used a lot less meat than the recipe typically calls for, but the substitute of roasted vegetables really brought it all together in a wonderful way. It was now not just a peasant dish for field workers, but something everyone had daily, because it was the best they could get. Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. Mock apple pie is another delicious dessert that clicked with masses across the nations during rough times. As apples were getting expensive, people were looking for cheaper alternatives. That is when the mock apple pie entered. Resemblance is one thing, but if the pie looks and tastes like it, then it might as well be an apple pie. Created using cheap and the nation-favorite Ritz crackers, mixing those with some vanilla syrup, sprinkle some lemon and cinnamon to create a perfect home-baked pie fit to rival apple pie. The Depression era onwards really saw an explosion in its popularity. We cannot really blame people either. Fresh, juicy apples were in hot demand and short supply. The pie was just as cheap as Hoover stew and easy to make. Nowadays, of course, you would not find this in houses you go to, despite it being popular enough that Ritz had instructions on the back of the box on how to make it. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. Then came the cornmeal mush, joining pies and stews on the list of economically sensible lunches. When times are tough, porridges become a very enticing meal, as affording bacon strips or other meats for breakfast was out of the question. Even if you got cheap beef jerky, you did not know if it was good and clean meat, and typical American breakfasts like grilled bacon and eggs were losing popularity due to price constraints. People needed their 7 a.m. nutrition, so cornmeal mush, an incredibly healthy dish, became popular. Topping the cornmeal with maple syrup, or in some cases a thick sausage gravy, elevated it in the taste department. It was not much of a fan favorite though, because the mush did not last long after the economy settled. Once people could afford better, they definitely went back to their regulars. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put 2 and 2 together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, bubble and squeak really emphasize the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? Next up, a dish that sounds almost too simple to be true: tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. I know, it doesn't exactly scream gourmet, but remember, we're talking about a time when people were just trying to survive. This combo was a way to stretch those precious few ingredients. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a cheap and filling staple, and tomato sauce was an easy way to add flavor. This dish was essentially a plate of creamy mashed potatoes topped with a savory tomato sauce. It might sound a bit unusual, but this combination was a hit because it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. Plus, potatoes were versatile. You could mash them, fry them, or bake them depending on what you had. So, if you're ever in the mood for a simple yet tasty meal, try tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. Let's see if this humble dish can impress our modern taste buds. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty, or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. So you might be surprised to hear party franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Fish soufflé and baked potatoes were a wonderful combination, the kind of thing that just bounces off of the beach of its different parts and sides. The fish soufflé, along with a generous serving of baked potato, wasn't just delicious, it was also extremely nutritious. This was probably one of the recipes that kept up health the most throughout the whole ordeal. You might be wondering how fish was common enough for the recipe to have this kind of weight behind it. It just so happens that if you lived near a coastal city back then, you were definitely in luck, at least compared to the rest of the population. Fishing skyrocketed, not as a hobby this time, but as a necessary skill. Fish were plentiful, and most of all, they were free. They were the main source of nutrition for a lot of places. When people had no use for fish as food, they'd sell it to make some quick money and get whatever necessities they needed. Besides, it was common enough to get things like crab in the waters back then too. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Up next, we have a dish that was all about making the most out of simple ingredients: spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole. It can be argued that Eleanor Roosevelt did the best she could during the Great Depression. The First Lady promoted dishes to encourage savvy homemakers, such as a casserole made from spaghetti, boiled carrots, and a simple white sauce of milk, flour, salt, and butter. The spaghetti had to be cooked for 25 minutes. The idea was to get the noodles mushy so they paired nicely with the boiled carrots and a penny's worth of creamy sauce. The result? a vehicle for nutrition and nutrients. Families loved this dish because it was versatile and could easily be modified based on what was available. It was a great way to fill up hungry bellies without breaking the bank. It still makes a pretty delicious meal for potlucks, so if you want to impress everyone with something easy to whip up, the spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole will do. Milk toast is exactly what the name suggests. Toasted to perfection bread dipped in milk with a generous slap of butter. On days when any meal you loved was unaffordable and getting up to cook something proper was dreadful, milk toast came through for many families. All you needed was some good fresh bread and a warm glass of milk to gorge on until you felt full. Milk toast quickly became one of the most popular breakfasts in the States, catering specifically to people below the poverty line who could not make most of the items on this list regularly. Nowadays, this might be considered a very vintage meal, the type to get kids asking you what century you might be from. But back then, it was something even working-class 20-year-olds would eat daily. Times have changed, and the breakfast of people in those socioeconomic classes is definitely different. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Now, if you think baking a cake without eggs, milk, or butter sounds impossible, think again. During the Dust Bowl, people got creative with their baking. This egg-free, milk-free, and butter-free cake was made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. It was impossible to live without cake even in times of desperation, so people decided to make do without the fancy ingredients. Now, I know eggs, milk, and butter don't sound fancy to us, but these ingredients were a luxury to find during the Dust Bowl days, and even if you did find some, it was never enough to whip up a whole cake. The cake might not have been as rich as its traditional counterparts, but it was a sweet treat that offered a bit of comfort during difficult times. Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out, and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. A pretty imaginative way of getting some familiar old flavors back into the weekly diet was mock food, specifically mock fish fillets. We're going to take a look this time at both this recipe and how exactly things like it became common. See, there's one thing about people from back then. While they definitely had it horrible, their circumstances really expanded their horizons in the kitchen. Mock culture was all about mimicking flavors of classic dishes with inexpensive ingredients. Stuff that was easy to get, wouldn't cut too deep into your pockets, and would also last you a good while. Mock fish fillets were actually made out of mashed potatoes. I really wasn't kidding when I said people really grew a newfound appreciation for potatoes. Recipes in cookbooks back then were using them in ways that the curly fries and hash brown-addled brains of you and I could only dream of. Still, there were times when even potatoes weren't available. In that case, they'd make use of bread. Now, you might naturally be wondering how bread even comes close to imitating the flavor of a fish fillet. Well, apparently, soaking it in some milk and mixing it with powdered eggs and flour actually forms a mixture that gets the texture down. Next, your spices: onion, parsley, pepper, and some pretty basic stuff, which was still easy enough to get. Though even those were stretched thin, spice cabinets would often run empty. Do you think this actually does the job? If you try it, share what you thought in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment down below telling us which of these dishes surprised you the most.